I wish I would have trained actually up to the day I left, but I trained up to a couple days before I left. And I did that for a whole calendar year, 7 days a week. I didn't take one day off. I stopped drinking alcohol for a whole calendar year. Matter of fact, I had the first drip of alcohol at Everest Base Camp, ironically. And so, I took it very serious. I was training 2 to 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, like I said, and had a routine that I fell into that kind of fit into my, not only my schedule, but my body type and, my athletic background, And so that's what I did. And I followed that routine religiously, like I said, for a whole calendar year, up until about 5-6 days before I went to jump on the airplane.
What's up, man? How was your weekend?
Yeah, can't complain. I was up in Boulder to Explorers Club speaking engagement. That's one of those organizations I'm part of, and I'm humbly honored that they took me into their organization. I was out in New York the week before for their annual dinner. So every year they have their annual symposiums and their big red carpet tuxedo gala and stuff. And so the different explorers from the 32 chapters around the world, and it's about 3,500 of us. And they usually come gather in New York, and it's, the first of everything. First to the moon, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong. First to the South Pole, North Pole, summit of Everest, the bottom of the Mariana Trench, Amelia Earhart, you name it. Jacques Cousteau, Walter Cronkite. These are all Explorers Club people. So I don't know why they decided to induct me into the Explorers Club, but I'm humbly honored. And it's a pretty interesting process. You have to be sponsored by at least 2 members. Then they put you in front of a board, and you don't know whether or not you're going to get accepted or not. You have to put it together like a 25-page, application. It's almost like writing a college essay. And then you get a notification, yeah, you're in or not or whatever. And yeah, they took me in. So this is my second year now going to this annual Explorers Club. They call it ECAD weekend. And you have a lot of famous people. Richard Gere was there, and Josh Gates is there, and all these different people that are in also entertainment. James Cameron is part of the Explorers Club. And you've got, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and, all these people that are, people you normally don't talk to on a daily basis.
That's exciting, man. I'm glad you shared that. We're going to keep that in there. Well, that rivals my weekend.
What'd you do this weekend? I'm assuming you're out on the trails or you're doing something.
I was going to hit the trails, but I went on a Facebook Marketplace, got a Peloton bike.
Heck yeah.
So I don't love indoor cycling, but for me to get all of the HIIT training and going to hit some zone 4, zone 5 type training, it's the only way to do it. Man. I can't get that on a hike, and I don't do hikes for that reason. So it's really the only thing. And when I train folks at the gym, I'm not hanging around afterward. I just got to get home.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's tough to do that. So I got that, set it all up. I've already done a couple rides. My wife's done 3 rides. She's rocking it.
Awesome.
And I'm sure they're going to be upset to hear that she's going to cancel her cycle bar membership.
How much did the Peloton cost?
So it cost me $500. So I got Generation 3.
Okay.
And it runs, if you don't buy any accessories, I think it runs you about $1,200.
Right.
Brand new. That doesn't include mat, doesn't include shoes, and the dumbbells, which I'm not using the dumbbells. That seems a little corny to me. So if there are any Peloton listeners, sorry. But that's not going to work for me. But comes with 3-pound dumbbells or something.
Okay. Just branded nicely.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Anyway, what else can I tell you about the weekend? Just working, man. I love what I do.
How's the weather out there
Preparing for this. The what?
How's the weather out there?
All weekend was raining. I actually had a coat back. It's Georgia. We're talking just north of Atlanta. I think it was Saturday. I had on a coat and gloves,
wow.
Which is ridiculous.
Wow. In Atlanta this time of the year, huh?
That's unusual.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That sounds like it.
Yeah, kind of crazy. But anyway, let me get all my questions and all that stuff rocking and rolling. Yeah, like I said, we're just going to roll. I'm going to ask a bunch of questions, and we're going to have fun here.
Heck yeah.
So normally what I do is I do kind of like the intro before, but I mean, we just got on and start chatting about some fun stuff. So I'm going to launch into the intro right now, okay?
All right, fair enough.
Okay, here we go. So today I'm talking with Alex Harz, the guy who filmed his entire journey from Lukla to Everest Base Camp and all the way up to the summit of Mount Everest. It's called the Quest Everest. Now, I know most of you listening probably aren't planning on summiting the tallest peak on Earth, but a lot of you might have your sights set on Everest Base Camp trek. We're going to cover both today. But first, let me just say, if you haven't watched Alex's documentary, do yourself a favor and check it out. Better yet, grab a friend or a spouse, especially if they haven't done much hiking or camping. You'll get a whole different perspective watching with someone who's never imagined themselves in that kind of extreme environment. For example, I got a lot of hiking experience, but my wife, on the other hand, has only done easy hikes. So when we watched it together, her reactions were priceless. So here's a few. On day 20, this is when the team pushed through the Khumbu Icefall for the first time, climbing through a maze of shifting ice towers and over nerve-wracking ladder crossings. My wife literally jumped off the couch and yelled, "Oh my God, no way." Okay? And then on day 21, this is when they hit the Western Khumbu for the first of 3 times, a crevasse-filled valley above the icefall. And she just looked at me and she said, "Are you effing kidding me?" And then on day 46, I think that's summit night at 26,000 feet, deep in the death zone where the air holds only 30% of the oxygen you get at sea level. The team is shown inching their way up with headlamps, cutting through the darkness. And my wife blurted, "They're in the dark. Holy you get it, right?" So anyway, by the time it was over, she was sweating just from watching and said she'd be perfectly happy sticking to her treadmill at 10% incline. So if you want a little taste of what it's like to take on the world's highest peak, stick around because we've got some great stories from Alex. So anyway, Alex, I'm really excited to talk to you. So any thoughts on what I just said there?
You know, it's interesting because you kind of brought back some of the feelings I had because I don't get a chance to think about it so much, except for when I talk to people like you and they bring it in front of my attention. Then all of a sudden I'm like, yeah, okay, all right, that is what happened. And that was the day we did that. And yeah, I mean, it's a 52-day process, to climb to the top of the world. So all that stuff starts to come back as you start to disseminate some of that information.
Yeah, well, what's some of the most surprising feedback you've gotten from someone who's watched it?
You know what? Maybe not the most surprising feedback, but probably the one that I stick to the most, and the one that was the biggest purpose of the films themselves, is the cultural aspect and historical aspect of Mount Everest and the Khumbu Valley, the Sherpa people, the people that work on Mount Everest, the significance of what Everest is to the country of Nepal, and Nepal's significance to Everest and vice versa. And that was really the point. Those are the points I really wanted to kind of hopefully get across to the audience, more than just a Red Bull film of me climbing Mount Everest, right? I didn't want it to be about me. I just wanted to be kind of the facilitator of the information. Yes, you're on my journey with me, but really all I am is a conduit to the information of the people that I interview along the way, the Lakbaritas and Hanuman Baba and all these different people that I talk to. That's what it was all about for me. And that was what we really wanted to get across, because we wanted to tell you the stories that you normally wouldn't see when it related to Everest-based content. And when people would mention that without me even asking them about it, or me saying, "Hey, what'd you like best? What'd you like least?" And they come out right away and they start talking about how neat that was, or "I didn't know that," or "I didn't know that." That's what's most near and dear to my heart.
Okay, cool. Well, you summited Mount Everest almost a year to the day.
Well, it's interesting because my summit anniversary from here on out will always be May 21st. Right. So it's one of those things that I'll never forget. I have a little ritual that I've started. And there's a place here in Colorado where I am at, and up in Golden, Colorado to be specific, called the Sherpa House. And ironically, a lot of the people, it's actually run and owned by Sherpas that came over from Nepal, and a lot of those Sherpas are from the Khumbu Valley. Matter of fact, all of them are, with the exception of some that may have moved down to Kathmandu later on in life, but they're all originally from the Khumbu Valley. So there's a lot of kind of direct connection to Mount Everest and to the journey that you see unfold within these films. And so as kind of an homage to them, I'm going to go on the 21st and have lunch or dinner at the Sherpa House.
That's cool. So, Sherpas living here in the West, I mean, what's it like when they're out of their element? That's got to be, I guess, living by the Colorado Rockies, does that give them, any solace at all?
Yeah, I think they gravitate initially to either Seattle, the Pacific Northwest, or to the Rockies, because that initial familiarity and comfortability of being in the mountains. So I think that if they come to the United States, typically from what I've heard from the Sherpas I've talked to, they end up pretty much in 3 locations. Either in the Pacific Northwest, in the mountains up there around Mount Rainier, here in Colorado where I am, or of course to New York, because that's the most common place where most people will immigrate to if they're coming in from Asia or Southeast Asia. So, but yeah, they seem to right away have a sense of geographical or physical home, and then they can kind of, work out the cultural aspects and so on. But yeah, it's interesting. And it's not easy for Nepalese people to get to the United States, so it's not the easiest process to get here. But when they do get here, they typically do a pretty good job of assimilating, especially if they end up in the Pacific Northwest or here in the Rocky Mountains.
Well, the other thing, the Sherpas I'm assuming, they go through training where they learn the English language learn how to communicate effectively. So coming here and assimilating and getting work is probably a bit easier for them, I suppose.
Yeah,
I don't
and
know.
most of the Sherpas that do come over are mountaineering Sherpas that were active in the trekking or hiking community or the climbing community in the Khumbu Valley. So they've learned English, from early on because of all the Westerners that will come there twice a year to trek in the beautiful Khumbu Valley or do something like I did and actually try to climb Mount Everest and the other peaks around. So yeah, most of the Sherpas that you see in the United States speak a pretty good amount of English, and they're very proficient in either understanding it or speaking it or both.
So we're almost to the 21st. So looking back, what perspectives have changed, if any? I know for me with some of my, 14er climbs, it's especially my first ones, it's easy to forget the struggle.
Mm-hmm.
You forget about that and then you're ready to take on the next one. But anyway, what do you have to say about that?
Well, one of the things that I noticed, I was in Nepal for 63 days because we were filming, these documentaries, the Quest Everest VR, the virtual reality documentary, and then the documentary that you saw with your wife, the 97-minute The Quest Everest documentary, which is a 2D film. We were there for 63 days, so we were filming on the Kathmandu Valley, and as you see in the movie, there's a lot of backstory, cultural backstory as it relates to Everest. So we were there for an additional 11 days filming that stuff, and then, of course, the 52 days of the trekking and the climbing of Mount Everest. So the thing that I probably immediately realized upon returning back to the United States was the little mundane things that would drive you nuts. Oh, the Amazon package didn't come today, or the mail didn't come today, or the trash guy didn't come to pick up the trash because yesterday was a holiday and therefore it's not going to come till next week or whatever. Those little trivial things kind of go to the wayside. They're not so serious anymore after going through an experience like trying to climb Mount Everest. So those are the little things that I notice. And of course, the other thing I notice is, just how much less engaged you may or may not be in your daily life because it's on autopilot. And, going to do an adventure like that definitely took me out of the autopilot mode for sure.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, you're talking a little bit about reentry and kind of what stays with you. My wife actually it was one of her questions for you. Let's talk about training. So how long did you train for the expedition and what did it look like? Let's say 12 weeks out, but yeah, you weren't in Nepal at that time, right?
No,
12 weeks out. Okay. So tell me what that looked like. Kind of like peak phase, 12 weeks out from.
Yeah, basically, I went under the ideology of going all the way up until the time you jump on a plane. And the reason why, because I knew I was going to be spending a couple of days in Kathmandu, getting the crew together, joining my climbing crew as well. So there's 3, 4, 5, 6 days there alone where you're not going to be doing anything but walking around Kathmandu. And then in that case, we use that opportunity to film and do some interviews and stuff like that. And then you actually start the trek. You go up to Lukla, you fly up there and you start that trek. So by the time you actually get to base camp, you're ready a couple weeks in Nepal. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to train. I wish I would have trained actually up to the day I left, but I trained up to a couple days before I left. And I did that for a whole calendar year, 7 days a week. I didn't take one day off. I stopped drinking alcohol for a whole calendar year. Matter of fact, I had the first drip of alcohol at Everest Base Camp, ironically. And so, I took it very serious. I was training 2 to 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, like I said, and had a routine that I fell into that kind of fit into not only my schedule, but my body type and, my athletic background, And so that's what I did. And I followed that routine religiously, like I said, for a whole calendar year up until about 5, 6 days before I went to jump on the airplane.
And did that involve step up, stairs, hiking? Just talk me through a few
let's
things.
say Monday I ran. I did distance running. So I ran between 10 to 15 miles every single Monday. Again, no exceptions. And then on Tuesday, the next day, I would go do step ups with heavy packs on. So somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500 step ups with anywhere from 25. And by the time I ramped it up to 65 pounds on my back. Again, it's an overkill. You're not going to carry that much load up the mountain. But it was one of those things that if there was going to be a need for that extra bit of strength that I needed to call on, I would have that in reserve. The next day I would do either wind sprints, hill sprints, stair sprints, or go out on an actual hike. And then the following day on Thursday, I would do upper body stuff to give my lower body a little bit of break. But I knew there's also a lot of jumaring. There's a lot of upper body stuff that you are going to be doing that you kind of passively do, that you don't think about much, but you don't want it to be something that becomes a focal point of your attention because you're feeling weak and not capable of going up, let's say, a 50 or 60 foot vertical crevasse wall. So I did that on Thursdays, and Fridays I would start that process again. I'd run another 10 to 15 miles. Saturday, again, I would do heavy pack step ups. Sunday, I would do hill sprints and either trek or climb or any kind of intervals on stairs. And then I'd repeat the process over and again.
So other than training up until the day you left, is there anything kind of looking back that you would have done differently to better prepare for the reality?
Yeah, the reality is I probably would have packed on as much as I can. I mean, I would have probably obsessively overate. Because the one thing that you're going to do no matter what when you go, even on the trek to base camp, if you're trekking to base camp, it takes 9 to 12 days, you're going to lose weight. You're going to burn more calories than you're taking in. And if you sat at Everest Base Camp and just read a book for 2 months, you're going to lose weight. So the thing is, I started losing weight really, really early on. So if you can have an excess amount of weight, 15 to 20 pounds of baby fat, that would be great because you're going to burn that off easily on the mountain during the course of those 52 days. I did not have that. I was a lean, mean, 4 to 6% body fat, machine by the time I got on the airplane heading to Kathmandu. And matter of fact, when I landed at Kathmandu, I was 197 pounds. When I got back to Kathmandu after the Everest expedition, I was 170 pounds. So I lost out 27 pounds of muscle mass. And that, of course, is difficult to get back,
Well, in the documentary, when you are going from Lukla up to Everest Base Camp, sometimes you're wearing a t-shirt and you can see your muscles. You can see how lean you were and how fit you were, but you weren't heavy. Now, I will say, okay, Ryan, no offense to Ryan, okay? But Ryan had packed on a little. He had a little body fat around the neck. And now looking back, that makes sense, right? I mean, Ryan's, how many high altitude summits does he have under his 25, 20 something or other?
Exactly. So,
right?
so he knows the deal.
Totally makes sense. Because when you look at him, you're like, okay, that guy looks a little less fit for something like this. But clearly his insides, his cardio, his muscles, physiologically, he was totally ready. He just had a little bit more body fat on. So how about that?
More fat, more carbs.
Now it makes sense. Well, now it makes sense. Yeah. Okay, cool. Sorry, Ryan. You look great. So what's one part of your body that took a beating in a way that you didn't anticipate? Was it lungs, legs, hands from the cold?
The whole body took a hard beating, but the thing that I didn't really anticipate as much were my toes. I had permanent nerve damage in all 10 of my toes. I lost all 10 of my toenails. They all fell off at base camp after I got back down, and parts of them were sitting actually in my boots by the time I took my boots off. And that's just because of the hundreds of thousands of toe strikes. And even though I sized up expedition boots, and I made sure that even with 2 or 3 socks on, again, I've climbed Denali and Aconcagua and other peaks and stuff like that. So, I'm pretty well experienced in mountaineering and knowing, the things to do and do not with your feet. I didn't expect them to take that much of a battering. But again, a lot of it has to do with lack of circulation, and a lot of it has to do with just toe strikes, hammering into the ice step after step, kicking one step after another. And I didn't expect that to be the case. The other thing I didn't expect as much, I read about the Khumbu cough. Again, I studied everything about Everest. I was obsessive about every movie, everything that came out about Everest. The thing that I didn't expect was the Khumbu cough, which is a real deal. And it's because of the dry air. It actually, essentially what it is like little microfibers of fiberglass kind of effect to the inside of your lungs because the air is so dry. For 2.5 weeks after I got off the mountain, I was incessantly coughing nonstop every day, all day, to the point where it was keeping me up at night. And that was just my lungs, not liking the dry air and the injury that I did to my air sacs inside the lungs. So those are 2 things I didn't expect. I didn't think were going to, be a major issue upon my return if I was humbly fortunate enough to make it up to the top and back down. Yeah. And of course I didn't expect to lose 27 pounds of muscle mass, but I knew I was going to lose weight. So I was prepared for that to happen.
Is there some kind of inhaler that post climb that would have been helpful?
And there's inhalers that you can actually wear while you're on the mountain. A lot of people will wear, for example, just a balaclava, so they're aspirating some of their own moisture back into their lungs, and you'll see that's very common. You even see sometimes it looks like a little face mask, almost like a, Hannibal Lecter style face mask or something. And that again is to keep some of that moisture of the air of every time you're expelling some of it on your next breath back into your lungs. So yeah, that's something I didn't do, only because I have bad sinuses. So anything that kind of inhibits my breathing or has a sense that it may inhibit my breathing, even if it does, I'm really hypersensitive to it. So I try to keep my mouth as free and clear as possible. But yeah, those little things could have helped or could have annoyed me to the point where I would have ripped it off anyway. So I don't know.
So what's the closest you came to turning back, either mentally or physically, and what pushed you to keep going?
That's a good question, because the whole time you're lying to yourself. As soon as you step foot in that Khumbu Icefall and you start to see this Russian roulette of Jenga blocks all around you with avalanches and Serac collapses and you name it, you're starting to lie to yourself. If you try to tell yourself, oh, it's okay, it's not so bad, and you know better. Deep down inside, you know better, you don't belong there, and you want to get out of there as soon as possible. So you try to be as efficient as possible to go through the Khumbu Icefall, as many times as you have to go through it to get to the top of Everest. And so right then and there, you start to realize, should I turn around? And I had an experience when we got to that first major ladder crossing, and you see it in the film. There's 3 Home Depot style ladders strung together by fishing twine, and it's bouncing up and down about 3 feet of sway. And you only have about 1 inch of purchase on the front of your crampons and another inch on the back of your crampons, which are the spikes at the bottom of your boots that actually give you traction on the ice and the snow that are on the rungs. And so you're just kind of tiptoeing methodically across these ladders as it's moving up and down, and you see nothing but blackness below you. So you got to kind of have that, clarity of not getting scared of heights and so on. And if you fall, it's bad. And we got to that first ladder crossing, and then there was a small group that was in front of us. And, I realized right then and there, well, everybody in here with me in this ice fall is probably type A, and they're definitely highly trained and highly motivated. So it's not like couch potatoes that are going there. A lot of people spent their whole life getting ready for this climb, but nonetheless, you have a lot of endurance athletes, ultramarathon runners, all the Olympic athletes, all these kind of guys that are there that are going to Everest. And the guy that was in front of me, he got up on the ladder, a couple guys before I got to that ladder, and he put that first rung on the ladder with his crampons and his boots, and he just started shaking violently. Like a deer in headlights, he just froze. And that's when, you realize, okay, there's your first gut check, because it wasn't the physical preparation for him, not even close. It was the mental thing that came into play, right? And again, your body says, turn around. It's a life or death, fight or flight kind of scenario. You have to overcome that. And you have to overcome that all the way up to the top of the mountain, either because you're out of energy or because you're in a dicey, hairy situation or because you've been out for 12 hours straight and you don't want to go another hour at all. But the thing I think that maybe helped me a little bit was I had a camera and had multiple cameras, and I was filming, and I was part of this Quest project. So that was almost like a war reporter analogy that come into play where, you're sitting there and you're documenting everything that's going on in front of you. And if you're a war reporter in Afghanistan or Syria or wherever you may have been in a conflict zone, you don't think about necessarily the bullets that are flying by your head, because you know what? I'm not a combatant. I'm just documenting this. Well, the bullets don't care. And sometimes the combatants on the other side that are shooting in your direction, they miss, they're horrible shots, or they just don't care. Mount Everest does not care. It's indiscriminate, so it's a constant game of wrong place, wrong time, right place, right time, and being prepared for those situations. So I think a lot of my having been hyper focused on filming this whole time also kind of gave me a false sense of security that maybe I'm in a safer spot than I really was, which of course can also be a double-edged sword. It could have got me killed, but luckily it did not. But I stayed hyper focused all the way to the end of the production. There could have been times where that might not have been the best case, but like I said, I'm humbly honored to come back down with 63 hours of content, 10 fingers and 10 toes, even though nerve damage and all 10 of those toes still persist till today.
Oh, that's interesting. All right. So the full Everest expedition took 52 days, starting from Lukla, moving up to the summit, and then back down to Everest Base Camp before a helicopter ride back to Kathmandu. So let me make sure I have it right. There's the main staging points for acclimatization or Everest Base Camp. That's at 17,598 feet on the Nepal side.
Right.
And then Camp 1, 19,900 feet. Camp 2, 20,968 feet. Camp 3, 23,497 feet. And Camp 4, 26,000 feet. And then the summit's 29,032 feet. So I think a lot of people imagine kind of a steady one-way climb to the top, but it's actually a series of exhausting rotations climbing up to higher camp and then dropping back down to recover before pushing higher again. So it seems more like a sawtooth pattern than like a straight line.
Exactly.
So to paint the picture, we're going to see how we flush this out. I don't know how this is going to work, okay? I'm going to ask you the question, and you can amend it and say it however you want, right? Walk us through the typical timeline starting from day 9. So day 9, you're at Everest Base Camp, right? All the way to day 52 when you make it back down to Everest Base Camp. So how many days do you typically spend at each camp? When you come back down, how many times do you have to push through those brutal stretches like the Khumbu Icefall before the final summit attempt? Take that however you want and just kind of paint a little picture. You don't have to be exact. Just, I think it's interesting.
Yeah. So when you're trekking to base camp, like you said, the 9 days, well, in those 9 days, you have 2 rest days typically. So because you're acclimatizing, you're going up to 17.5 and that's not easy. You just don't go straight to 17.5. So you stop at different places along the way. Sometimes you have 3 rest days, it just depends on how fast your team is and what the rotation is or the cycle that they want to do to get to base camp. Once you get to base camp, you rest a couple more days. You get settled in, you're there now for essentially another month and a half. So it becomes a tent city at 17,500 feet that sits on a flowing slab of ice, the Khumbu Glacier, the highest glacier in the world, that's moving at 3 to 6 feet downhill every single day. So you're getting acclimatized, you're settling in. Okay, what's my daily routine? What do? I get up, I do this, I do that, and do that. And then you'll start doing some icefall training, and you see that in the film. So because nowhere else in the world would you go climb an icefall like the Khumbu Icefall to get to the summit of any peak. It doesn't exist anywhere else. And the only reason why you do it is because you want to get to the highest point on Earth. And in order to get to the highest point on Earth from the Nepal side, you're going to have to go through the Khumbu Icefall. So you do some ladder training, some rope work. You go into the lower icefall, and you work on some anchors and how you're going to Jumar. Because again, it's not that you don't necessarily a well-trained mountaineer. Those just aren't skills you're not going to use. You're not going to use it on Mount Rainier. You're not going to use it on Aconcagua. You're not even going to use it on Denali, for example. So these are things that you want to kind of get just right in your head, all dialed in before you really dive into the icefall. So that takes a little bit of while. And so after, several days, you'll go into the icefall and you do kind of some recon. You start getting an idea of how the rope works, so you can kind of adjust on, okay, how do I rappel most efficiently? How do I go up it? How do I use the Jumar most efficiently? How do I clip in with two clipping points at all time? So if one fails, the other one catches you at the last anchor point and these kind of things. Then we went halfway into the icefall, again, a little bit of recon, but to get an idea of what that's like to go 2,000 feet, 2.5 miles to the icefall to get to Camp 1 on this undulating up and down steep icefall, crevasses, so on and so on, to get your way up to Camp 1. Then we finally went to Camp 1, and that was on day 20, right, of the climb of the expedition at this point. And then at that point, when we got to Camp 1, the first thing we did is we set up tent, and then we had a rest day at Camp 1. The next day, on day 21, we went halfway to Camp 2. So we went through most of the crevasse fields in the western Khum, including a very steep 55 to 60-foot crevasse wall that we had to climb up to Jumar up and then rappel back down. And then we came all the way back to Camp 1, spent the night again, and then we went all the way on the third day back down to base camp to rest and get ready for the next acclimatization rotation.
All right, so I have to interrupt you. That was another expletive from my wife. She's like, really? So now you're going to go all the way back down to Everest Base Camp? Blew her mind. Like, after all that work, what, really? You're going to come back down again? And then you have to go through the Khumbu Icefall again? So anyway, I just wanted to let you know, people see that in the film, and it's surprising.
It's, your wife is spot on, because, Marcus, that is demoralizing. One of my pet peeves, when I climb a mountain, I absolutely hate losing elevation. I hate it, because you work so hard to gain it, and then you give it back up. And on Everest, you got to do it a couple times, and you have to do a greater decrease of elevation loss the higher you go. So it becomes even more demoralizing. So again, it comes back to lying yourself that, it's okay, I can go back up to the icefall again. I can go and gain those 5,000 feet back that I just lost to get up to the Lhotse face, So then you go back to base camp, you take a couple rest days, you might go do another acclimatization hike near base camp before you go up for your second rotation. Again, that's a team by team decision. And then we went up for our second rotation. So when we went up for our second rotation, again, we go up to the icefall. We stopped at Camp 1, spent the night. The next day, we went to Camp 2. We spent the night. The next day, we then went up halfway up the Lhotse face. And the Lhotse face is this 5,000-foot wall of ice that connects basically Camp 2 to Camp 4 with Camp 3 in between. And Camp 3, the reason why Camp 3 is situated at 23,400, 23,600 feet, depending on where you set up your tent, is kind of a carved-in ledge like this that goes into the face. And that's the only place on the face where it's relatively flat where you could actually set up a camp. The other reason why you go up there and try to tag 23,300 or 400 or 23,600 feet is because that's the highest your body can acclimatize. Your body can no longer produce any more red blood cells above that altitude, so there's no reason to go any higher than that until you're going for the summit. So you go and you tag Camp 3, and then you go, like your wife said, all the way back down to base camp. Then you're waiting on a different factor of why you're going for the summit in the last rotation. Now that's based primarily, a lot of it has to do on the health of the team. How healthy is the team? Has anybody gotten sick? We had one of our Sherpas had to get heli-evac back to Kathmandu in altitude sickness. How are people feeling physically? Have they picked up a flu like I did? All these different factors that you can't predict until you go. But the main factor that dictates on when you're going to go for the summit is based off of two things. A, the jet stream. And most people are aware of the jet stream. It flies right over the United States, and it kind of undulates across our North American continent, but it flies around the whole world. And a matter of fact, it flies over the summit of Mount Everest. And a lot of times of the year, it's flying over the summit of Everest. So you can't even go up there. And the reason why May is the month that everyone tries to summit Mount Everest is because the second factor that comes into play is the low pressure systems that start off the coast of India and the Bay of Bengal will start the monsoon season and will push up into the Himalayas, which will then move the jet stream just far enough off the summit of Everest at some time in May. Sometimes it's multiple days, in these weather windows, as they call it, 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, 1 day, whatever, throughout, early, mid-May up towards maybe the latest around the 27th of May. Sometimes there'll be multiple weather windows. Sometimes there's only one, but every year at some point in time, typically the jet stream is pushed off the summit of Everest long enough for you to get that chance to try to get up there where the wind speed is low enough to make it up there. Otherwise, the wind speed could be over 100, 150 miles an hour and you're not going up there. So that's how you try to time it for that last rotation to go for the summit. And you don't get your projections on those winds based off of localized weather. It's not like, oh, let's look outside. It's 72 and sunny today. Wind speed 15 miles an hour. No, it's not how it works. It's based off of global weather patterns, i.e. the jet stream, the low pressure system off the coast of India or the Bay of Bengal, and the high and low pressure systems around the Earth that are constantly moving around the planet. And so we actually got our weather projections from a guy in Belgium, which were thousands of miles away from Nepal. But because he is an excellent meteorologist for global weather trends and to be able to read high altitude weather trends, especially in the Himalayas, that's why we made our projections then. And ironically, even as good as he is, our original projection was for the 18th of May, which turned out to be a horrible day. And then we pushed it back to the 21st. So when you make that decision on when you go, well, it takes 5 days to get to the summit. So now you have to calculate 5 days before that you hope that window is going to be open when you get up there. And when you go, you're pot committed. And now it's just in the hands of fate. And you hope that you chose the right day to try to make it up for that summit. Because when you get to Camp 4 at the South Col up in the death zone at 26,000 feet, you're there only one time. And that's your chance to try to go up, and hopefully the weather's working out and everything else is working out and the camps are all situated with oxygen and everything's ready to go for your one chance to go to the top of the world. And that's when we went up for the third time, was based on our projection of when we thought that the weather was going to look good. And in our case, it was the 21st that we went for. And not every team follows those projections. They have their own weather guys. They have their own theories on going early versus going late. Some go in the middle of that block of time between the 9th of May to the 27th. So everyone has their own theory on when to best go, because if you go too early, you could have horrible weather and it's freezing cold. If you go too late, you might miss it, and the monsoons may have already come and hit Everest, and now it's just a perpetual snowfall, and you're never going up. And if you're in the middle, you have to kind of decide, is today the time or not the time? And if you don't decide those at least 5 days or a week out, you miss that window. So yeah, it's a calculated gamble, and then you just go.
So being that it is May 2025, has anybody summited yet this year?
Yeah, the rope team is up there. The rope team has made it to the top, and the first handful of summits that were based off the rope team made it to the summit. So now actually, as we sit here and talk today, everyone's sitting at base camp or camp 2, either trying to get out ahead of it, trying to find when they're going to try to hit their weather window. And I'm assuming we're going to see some summits this week, if not this weekend. And so it should be getting pretty interesting this week on Everest.
So I did a little research, and it says it is anticipated about 700 to 800 people will summit Mount Everest this year. But if you strip out like the Sherpas and the support staff, how many paying adventurers do you think will make it this year? Or just
again,
do on average?
So let's say if there's 425 of those would be climbers. Then of course you have a quick attrition rate. So some have already dropped out by now. A good amount have already dropped out by now during the first 2 climbing rotations. Either A, they couldn't hack it, B, they got sick, whatever the case may be. The risk was too high that they couldn't mitigate that, and so they decided, I'm not going to walk across those ladders in the icefall, or this is just too dangerous for me. And so by the time this time rolls around, and then you can say that there's going to be another significant amount of money, people that aren't going to make it. Let's say if there's 425 that started out, and if the weather windows are good, meaning there's enough days to try to get people up there, maybe somewhere between 250 to 300 might make it.
Okay.
Maybe less.
Interesting. Wow.
Maybe less. We shall see.
Yeah.
Again, right now it comes down to the weather, and it's a mad scramble of trying to make the best judgment call. And then, of course, that can open up its own can of worms. But knock on wood, hopefully everything goes pretty smoothly in the next couple of weeks, and we shall see what that total number turns out to be. But yeah, the success rate varies from year to year, but there's no guarantee that even if you made it this far through the first 2 rotations that you're going to make it. The hardest is still to come.
So with expeditions costing like upwards of $120,000 and helicopter rescues could be $10,000 unless you have insurance. But anyway, how do you mentally prepare for the financial risk on top, of the physical and emotional strain?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because in my case, I was carrying a very heavy workload on the financial side of things because I had a production that was dependent on me as well. So maybe that added even some more pressure to succeed, to make this project come to fruition. But yeah, the financial side, they don't care. The banks don't care. They want their notes paid. I guess the benefit is if I didn't make it back down, and if I would have been 342, there's over 340 dead bodies up there, that if I would have been one of those, then I guess I would never had to pay back any loans. I guess that's the plus
You're
side.
a true optimist.
Yeah. There's always a silver lining. There's always a plus side to everything. But yeah, there was an increased financial pressure on me to come down with the virtual reality footage and the 2D footage that we set out for by the time we got to base camp to make this successful. But I did tell my cameraman, my lead cameraman, I said, Sam, if I die here on this mountain, wherever it may be, and if you can't recover my body, which of course, depending on where you die, it's highly unlikely the higher you go that your body's ever coming down, do me a favor, pull those memory cards and just do something with it. I don't know what. You decide. I trust you. You make the best judgments of what to do with it, but make something of it so it's not all for naught,
Interesting. Was there a particular scene that almost didn't make it into the documentary because it was too risky or technically challenging?
there was a couple of them. I mean, I tried to avoid, on some of the dark side stuff, especially the dead bodies. You see, of course, in the documentary, there is a part where I cut to a body because it was a very interesting situation. I'm all by myself at 27,300 feet, waiting for the most beautiful sunrise to ever, hit these 2 eyeballs. And so I stopped all by myself, and I was just going to watch it, do a little bit of filming, but really just take in that moment because I had no one around me at that time. And I saw the most beautiful sunrise I've ever seen. This massive orange glow coming in over Tibet, hitting Makalu, the 5th highest mountain in the world, Lhotse, the 4th highest mountain in the world, the South Col below us where we just came from when we were climbing all throughout the night, and I saw that. And then I saw this weird black rock in the distance. And as more sun came up, I realized that rock wasn't black, it was red. And I zoomed in a little bit on the camera, and then I had this really kind of strange out of the body experience because I was looking at myself laying there dead in the snow because he's wearing the exact same down suit that I'm wearing. And so I started thinking to myself, I said, oh, why is he laying there dead in the snow and I'm still standing? Who is this person? I had no idea about his backstory. I don't know how long he's been laying there, but again, I'm looking at a mirror image to myself. I'm realizing I know he was a type A guy. I know he was highly motivated to get to this point, Then I told myself, don't sit down, don't stop, because a lot of times if you sit down, you never get back up. Keep going, you can do this, and stay focused. But that was one of those moments where it kind of hits you. And of course, you're hypoxic as can be up there. So you have kind of this martini effect where you feel like you're a little bit tipsy. As you go higher in altitude, you get that martini effect because you're so hypoxic, again, because the amount of oxygen density is so low up there that you just got to kind of stay hyper focused, laser focused in on the job at hand and keep going. But that was definitely one of the moments. Another moment was there was a Japanese climber who was the #1 Japanese mountaineer in the world. This was his 7th attempt on Everest. He failed or wasn't successful the 6th previous time. He was going again for the 7th time and he ended up dying. And I had a chance where I could have filmed his body laying in a tent. And I was only going to do it not for the film, but as the possible video closure for his family back in Japan. I knew nothing about him at the time. I didn't know who his family was. I had no connection to this guy personally, but I thought maybe I should film some of this footage and then try to track down who this person was and their family so they can have some sort of closure possibly on where they lost their son. But I decided against it and didn't do that. So there are times where I thought better of it, or I thought times, maybe I shouldn't film this because I'm standing underneath a serac and I need to get going, and you don't want to just spend underneath the serac any longer that you have to, especially if it's the size of your house and it's creaking and making these ominous noises like 100-year-old northeastern, house that hasn't had any oil on their hinges in 50 years. You're like, okay, I got to get going. Got to get going.
Very interesting. Let's kind of come back down the mountain again, and let's talk about what you were trying to capture from the beginning of the documentary up to Everest Base Camp. Okay, and what did you want the viewer to take away from that part of the journey?
Yeah, I wanted to take, and this goes back to the cultural and historical aspect of the film. For example, a lot of people in the public have a misconception that Sherpa means porter or high altitude worker or mountaineer. It's not. It's actually an ethnic group that came over from the Khumbu region of Tibet about 350 years ago. 650 years ago. And those are the Sherpa people. It's an ethnic group that's settled in the Khumbu Valley. It just happens to be where Mount Everest is, the mountain that sits right behind me here on the map. That's the dead end of the valley that they settled in 640 years ago. And that happens to be Mount Everest, where one side is Tibet or China and the other side is Nepal. And because of that, a lot of people don't realize that. And why do they have these, physiological benefits at altitude? Well, spending 600 plus years, generation after generation at that altitude, they've gained about a 10% physiological altitude advantage to altitude. Wanted to talk about that. I wanted to show the beautiful scenery and the spirituality and what it's actually like to go on that 9-day bucket list adventure to Everest Base Camp versus just teleporting me to base camp and let's do a Red Bull style movie up the mountain. That wasn't the goal of the film. And so, we try to talk about the various villages along the way. We talk about the historical significance, the economic impact that Mount Everest has. For example, if you go one or two valleys over from the Khumbu where they don't have Mount Everest, their economy is completely different. They don't have trekkers coming every spring and every fall to try to go to Everest Base Camp or to go to Amada Blam or to see any of these other beautiful mountains where there's been kind of an infrastructure set up by these Sherpa people with lodges along the way. They don't have any of that. A lot of them are still yak herders or salt traders, and so their economy is completely different from what the Sherpa's economy was up until 1953, when Everest first was summited by Tenzing Norgay and Sir Edmund Hillary. That changed the Sherpa people's lives forever. So I wanted to talk about that kind of stuff, and I wanted the audience to get to see what it actually looks like if you decide to go to base camp, and I did that in VR as well. So you're climbing with me all the way to the top of the world or all the way down the Khumbu Valley. So it's the closest possible experience of what it's like to trek to base camp, or a closest possible experience of going to the summit of Everest without being dumb enough to get off your couch and trying it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was, my wife was just so complimentary about, everything about the film. And before she got really stressed out and started sweating, up above the Everest Base Camp, I could just tell how much she enjoyed what you were trying to depict and everything from the very beginning of your film. So kudos on that. So I imagine it must feel like you can take on any mountain in the world now, kind of like a real sense of freedom. And I bring this up because a lot of people listening to this might have already pushed themselves, maybe to Everest Base Camp or the summit of Kilimanjaro, and that kind of experience can be transformative. So they can relate in a way. But what I want you to do is, for those still sitting at their desk, maybe dreaming about their next big adventure, talk to them about the importance of pushing yourself, of going beyond those self-imposed limits.
That's a great question, Marcus. And that's spot on, because one of the other takeaways, and I didn't mention this earlier because I figured, maybe we'd get into it if it came up. Two really major takeaways, from a physical standpoint, from an inner reflective standpoint, that I came with from a mountaineering perspective on Mount Everest. And one is that no matter how tired you are, for example, let's say you're sitting in the office right now watching this and you're doing an 80-hour week because you have a project deadline that has to get done by next Monday. Well, rest assured, you can do that 96 hours a week. Or let's say you're training for a marathon and you want to do your first ever Boston Marathon and you're like, I can't run more than 26 miles. Yes, you can. You can run over 30 miles. Whatever that might be, what I learned was you have 20% more in the tank than you ever thought you had in your tank. And I was a college Division I soccer player, and I was in better shape when I went to Mount Everest than when I was playing Division I college soccer. And I realized that if I wanted to make it to the summit of Everest, I had to go 20% harder than any game I ever played in college. But that's also the difference between living and dying, or making it to the top, or coming back down, or not. So if you ever sit there and wonder, man, can I make it to the top of Kilimanjaro, or can I do the rim to rim trail, or can I go to, for example, Everest Base Camp, and you feel like you just can't get any more out of your training, or for example, the training that you provide, then just be rest assured, everybody's got that additional 20% in them. And that's what Everest taught me. So when you think that you've hit the wall, you haven't. You've got 20% more. The other thing is that I, take away from it as well is it's really not about climbing Mount Everest. It's about conquering your own Everest. Whatever that Everest is. Is that trying to become a VP in your company? Is it trying to get these projects out on behalf of your company? Is it to do the rim to rim? Is it to do the Everest Base Camp? Whatever your personal Everest is, set your sight on that. Do everything you can do to stay hyper focused on that and conquer your own Everest. And those are two things that I really, took away from this, because really when you boil it back down to a very simple perspective, those are two things that I think can serve you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's great. So what advice would you give to someone planning an Everest Base Camp trek, whether it's about travel logistics, training, mental preparation needed to take on the challenge? Just throw out anything.
Yep. A couple things. First and foremost is take it slow. Unless you're used to going to high altitude, especially up to 17,500 feet or higher, take it slow. Find a company. And if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'd be more than happy to put them in contact with really good, reputable companies out there. Matter of fact, people that my friends work for, or my friends own, which I say, look, this person is coming. Can you make sure that, that they take it slow and they do it right and so on, is take it slow. Because you not only want to get to base camp successfully, because it is a bucket list adventure. It is amazing to go to Everest Base Camp. And if the weather's right, to just get a small glimpse of this summit pyramid that's behind me through the cracks of Nipsey and the west shoulder of Everest, and just to see 29,032 feet from below with your own eyes is mind-blowing. Matter of fact, it just gave me goosebumps talking about it. So take that slow and enjoy every bit of scenery along the way, and then inundate yourself into the amazing Sherpa culture of the Khumbu Valley, the spirituality of the Khumbu Valley. Don't just, mindlessly go down the trail, but actually take it in. Stop, smell the coffee, so to speak, and take in the unbelievable views and the amazing spirituality and culture that you will inevitably be impacted by. Even if you're not remotely spiritual at all, it will impact you over the course of those 9 to 12 days to base camp, because it's all around you everywhere you go. And the last thing is, you go when you think it's good for you. There's 2 times a year that's a good time to go. You have the time right now, the April, May time before the monsoons come, and even in the fall, after the monsoons are done. October is a great time to go, for example. There's also a lot less people that go there then. So maybe you want to go, in the fall instead of going in the spring when most people go. Kind of just plan it out based on your lifestyle, but knowing that you can go at the bookends of the year. You can go in the spring or you can go in the fall. And you can even go into the early winter if you don't mind the extreme cold. So yeah, know that those are options to you, and then just set your sight on when you want to go and take those steps to A, train, and B, to be able to experience it to the best of your ability, so you can really come away with an amazing experience.
So I did another podcast with a buddy of mine named Will Burkhart, and it was episode 13. In it, he suggests hitting some 14ers in Colorado to see how you respond to 14,000 feet, prior to an Everest Base Camp trek, if you have the opportunity to do so. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely, 100%. If you can get to altitude, especially anywhere in the, lower 49 states in the United States, and get either into the Northwest or here in the Rocky Mountain region, get to 14,000 feet, that's a very good advice. Because the thing is, your genetic disposition to altitude becomes more and more apparent every 1,000 feet you go higher, even less than 1,000 feet. But let's say at every stage, 1,000 feet, once you start getting above 11,000 feet or so. So you see it with people that come out here to go skiing to the Rocky Mountains. They go to Vail, they go to Aspen, they go to Breckenridge, wherever. They come in from the East Coast, West Coast, all across the world from sea level. They all of a sudden they land at DIA, Denver International Airport, and they right away take a rental car or shuttle up to the mountains, and they at 9,000, 10,000 feet where their lodge is. And then all of a sudden the next day they feel horrible, or they're up on the first lift going halfway up the mountain and they feel horrible. And they think, well, it's because I had too many beers the night before. No, or I didn't sleep well the night before. No, it has to do with altitude. You're actually having some acute acute mountain sickness, slight degrees of altitude sickness. So you're right. If you can get to the highest amount of altitude possible, up to 17,000 feet, whenever you have those opportunities, the better, because that's when you know whether or not you're either able to go to altitude. That's strictly a genetic thing, and you don't know until you go. And B, how comfortable you feel and what things you can do to try to help that with, i.e., ginkgo and hydration and vitamins and these different things and supplements that can help you as well. Diamox and so on. That getting to altitude can never be understated how important that is if you're going to Everest Base Camp or anywhere else that's, in the extreme high altitudes of 17,500 feet.
Okay. It gives people an excuse to take an extra trip out to Colorado.
Absolutely
hit some 14ers.
Right. Absolutely right.
Yeah, there's some technical ones. There's some easy ones.
That's right.
Everybody can get the opportunity to experience, that kind of altitude and see how they respond. But anyway, this film was so amazing. So talk to us about, what kind of art you're going to create in the future. What do we have to look forward to?
Yeah. So, this is the Quest Everest. 2D documentary, 97 minutes long that we're talking about. We also have that sister production called the Quest Everest VR, which is a 26-minute virtual reality documentary. You can watch it on Meta, you can watch it on Apple Vision Pro, however you want to put your VR headsets down, or even for people that will never put a VR headset on, you can also watch it in 2D VR 360, where you can use your mouse to spin around and stop and look down a crevasse or look out over the summit, with me on from the summit and look 200 miles into India, 200 miles into Tibet, 200 miles in Nepal. It's the next best thing. If you aren't able to put a headset on, you can watch that on Vimeo if you want to experience that, or Rival Space and other different platforms. And you can see that, find those links at thequesteverest.com. But it's an ongoing series, so our next one's going to be in Africa. And the series basically is designed to take global audiences on these epic educational thrill rides to reveal these rarely seen stories that they normally wouldn't have a chance to experience, especially in parts of the world that you wouldn't have access to, and hopefully you'll learn something along the way. Like I said, these educational thrill rides. And so it's an ongoing series, and some will be in 2D, some will be in VR, depending on where we go. But, the first ones were the Quest Nepal, the Quest Everest, and the Quest Everest VR. And like you said before, now you feel like you might be able to conquer any mountain in the world. Well, it's really not about, again, conquering Mount Everest, but it was more of a pilot of concept, a proof of concept for the series, that if we could film this content on Mount Everest, we're pretty confident we can go to other parts of the world and be able to get that content as well under that format of taking people on these educational thrill rides, and so we had to kind of prove that it would work. And again, we came back down with 63 hours of content. I'm humbly honored to have done so. And so our next one's going to be in Africa, most likely. And we're either going to go shoot later this year or the first part of next year. And we'll be excited to share that with the rest of the world when the time comes. And you'll be one of the first people to hear about it when that time comes.
All right, well, that's a lot to look forward to. So you mentioned your website. Any other sites, email address?
Like you said, the easiest is go to thequesteverest.com, thequesteverest.com. You got links through to the 2D film or the VR film. And then, of course, if you want to follow us along on, the social media stuff, you can go to the Quest series, Facebook page. It's actually the Quest series page is called. It's the Quest series on Instagram. And you can, check out what we're doing and what's most recent and current with our productions, as well as, send us a DM if you want to talk to any of our guys about this, that, or the other thing. So yeah, the Quest series is out there on social media as well.
All right. So did we leave anything on the table at all that you want to mention, talk about?
Well, I think maybe the last thing I would like to mention is that, hopefully people, like I said before, get something out of these films and out of these productions, and that, you're able to learn something along the way. I think the visuals will speak for themselves. I think they're pretty grandiose. I think the visuals are pretty powerful. They're pretty amazing. But more importantly, I hope the content as well that goes along with the visuals, that you're able to take something from it, just besides me going to the summit of Mount Everest and back. So,
yeah. Well, it was a true success. It's not typically something that my wife and I sit down to watch. So, get out of your, maybe you watch series, maybe you watch sports, whatever. This is a big departure for what my wife and I sit down to watch. And I encourage everybody to do the same thing. It will unlock certain emotions and in yourself and visuals that you've never seen and most likely will never see. So kudos to you, man. That was amazing. So great work.
Well,
can't wait for the next thing.
Marcus, thank you so much. I'm humbly honored to A, talk to you about this, B, that you and your wife enjoyed it. That really means an awful lot to me. And that to me is the most important thing, that you, your wife, or anyone else that turns out to watch either of these films, that they take away something from those films. And that's really what the Quest series is all about. And again, like I said, I'm humbly honored that you guys very much enjoyed it.
Yeah, great work. All right, my friend. It was great to talk to you. We'll be in touch. Who knows about what? But looking forward to that next time, whenever.
Thanks so much, Marcus.
All right, take care, buddy. That concludes this episode of the Hike Strong podcast. I'm committed to keeping all of the episodes for free. All I ask is that you subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. And don't forget to share this podcast with your friends. My goal is to build a vast community of hikers with the confidence to crush any local or global trail. I hope you will join me in this endeavor. So until next time, train, hike, repeat, and as always, I'm here to support you every step of the way.